Rootvolutionary presents a story from the final desperate days of the American Civil War, where a single confrontation would reveal a troubling truth behind the romanticized legend of the Confederate horsemen. In this detailed examination, we pull back the curtain on the events of late March 1865, a period not just of military maneuvering, but of profound consequence, where the very soul of a cause was tested under the relentless pressure of defeat. The choices made in the mud and rain during these crucial hours would expose the crumbling foundation of a rebellion and challenge the myths that had long surrounded its most celebrated fighters. The 1865 confrontation that revealed the flaws in the Confederate cavalry. In the closing chapter of the American Civil War, the destiny of a fractured nation was poised on a knife's edge. While the low rumble of distant artillery shook the very ground of Virginia, two powerful armies maneuvered toward a violent meeting at Five Forks, a critical junction whose ownership would dictate the future. With the aggressive Union General Philip Sheridan applying constant pressure, Confederate General George Pickett confronted a profound personal dilemma, burdened by command and the looming shadow of a lost cause. As darkness enveloped the landscape on April 1st, 1865, the atmosphere was thick with apprehension. This battleground transformed into a stage for bedlam, where heroism and hopelessness moved in a fatal embrace. With their very existence at stake and futures irrevocably linked, men in blue and gray confronted their deepest terrors. Would courage overcome impossible circumstances, or would the historical record mark this moment as the final unraveling of the Confederate dream? This intense account emerges from the gunpowder haze and violence of combat, exposing more than a mere military engagement. It was the decisive juncture in a fight for existence. With leadership failing and uncommon valor rising from the ranks, observe how choices made under extreme pressure created consequences that would define a country's memory. Prepare to be immersed in a story where bravery meets destiny, and every single action could change the future irrevocably. This is Five Forks, a place where myths were created and fates were sealed. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Rootvolutionary to join our growing community of history enthusiasts. A relentless pouring rain soaked the gray-clad soldiers of Major General George Pickett's enlarged division on the morning of March 30th, 1865. Trailing behind the infantry was Colonel William Pegram, with 6 cannon dragged through the mire by exhausted horses. The weary Confederates attempted to disregard the awful conditions as they marched west of White Oak Road, creating distance from the primary Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, which was holding the line at Petersburg, Virginia. The objective for Pickett's men was the vital intersection called Five Forks, just a short distance ahead. The deep mud and relentless rain were not their sole obstacles. Federal cavalry was closely monitoring the Confederate formation. Rather than advancing, Pickett chose to halt, arrange a regiment into a battle line, and await an assault, according to Captain W. Jordan McCabe, who was Pegram's assistant. This choice cost them a great deal of precious time. By the afternoon, Pickett's soldiers finally arrived at Five Forks. There, they met Major General Fitzhugh Lee and his 2 brigades of Virginia cavalry, who had spent the entire day striving to keep the enemy horsemen at bay. Confederate Army Commander General Robert E. Lee had directed Pickett and Fitz Lee to initiate a first strike against a substantial Federal cavalry force assembling 6 miles southeast of Dinwiddie Courthouse on the Boydtown Plank Road. It was absolutely vital for Lee's army to drive off Major General Phil Sheridan's cavalry at the courthouse, as they presented a grave danger to the South Side Railroad, the final rail connection under Confederate authority leading into Petersburg. A Federal success in severing this line would inevitably cause the collapse of both Richmond and Petersburg. With darkness approaching swiftly, Pickett determined to stay at Five Forks overnight. He commanded his troops to build defensive breastworks, which they accomplished as effectively as possible before trying to rest while the rain continued to fall. The future of Lee's army was a heavy responsibility on Pickett. By the end of March 1865, the circumstances confronting General Lee were extremely dire. For almost 10 months, his forces had withstood an unending siege at Petersburg in a bitter fight to protect Richmond, the Confederacy's capital. The defensive lines extended over 30 miles from Richmond south to Petersburg, and then another 6 miles southwest to Hatcher's Run. Union General-in-Chief Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant had managed to severely weaken his opponent. In February 1865, Lee's forces had approximately 55,000 troops. But by late March, that figure had dwindled due to desertions and casualties from continual fighting. Facing Lee were 128,000 Federal troops from 2 armies. The larger Army of the Potomac was under Major General George Meade, while the smaller Army of the James was led by Major General Edward Ord. Furthermore, Major General Phil Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah had come to Tidewater from the Shenandoah Valley to reinforce Grant. In late March, Grant developed plans for Major General Gouverneur Warren's V Corps and Major General Andrew Humphreys's 2nd Corps to march around the Confederate right flank at Hatcher's Run. After outflanking that position, they were to turn north. Grant's goal was to lure Lee's forces from their fortified trenches by making them protect the South Side Railroad. This would force Lee to withdraw some units from his line, weakening it sufficiently for other Union troops to achieve a breakthrough. Sheridan held a key part in this strategy to block access to the South Side Railroad. His cavalry corps was assigned to move left of both Union Infantry Corps and take Dinwiddie Courthouse as a base for operations. His subsequent goal was to gain command of Five Forks. Ford's Road, a primary route through Five Forks, led straight to the South Side Railroad. If the Confederates left their earthworks to fight in the open, Sheridan had instructions to fix them in place, while Grant's other units moved up to support an assault at Five Forks. However, if the Confederates stayed in their Petersburg defenses, then Sheridan's cavalry was ordered to damage tracks on both the South Side Railroad and the Richmond and Danville Railroad. The 2 rail lines connected at Burkeville, Virginia. The Richmond and Danville line led deeper into Southern territory. In the early hours of March 29th, Major General Romaine Ayres's division from Warren's 5th Corps started its march to flank the Confederate positions. Following Ayres were Major General Charles Griffin's 1st Division and Major General Samuel Crawford's 3rd Division. Ayres' troops got to Rowanty Creek by late afternoon. The Union 2nd Corps followed after building a pontoon bridge over the creek before continuing toward their goals. Warren ordered Griffin's division to turn north onto Quaker Road at noon, a key move in the plan. Meanwhile, Sheridan's Cavalry Corps left its camp before sunrise on March 29th with resolve. Major General George Crook's 2nd Division moved out along Jerusalem Plank Road, while Brigadier Generals Thomas Devon's 1st Division and George Custer's 3rd Division followed behind Crook. Sheridan remained in command of his cavalry corps under Major General Wesley Merritt during this pivotal period. They got to Dinwiddie Courthouse that night after a lengthy march. Confederate scouts reported to Lee that Federal cavalry was advancing. Lieutenant General James Longstreet recommended forming a special force to address the threat to the South Side Railroad. He suggested to General Lee that this force include Pickett's division from Longstreet's Corps in Richmond, a major cavalry unit, and several artillery batteries. Lee consented and ordered Pickett to get ready for this duty. Lee also told his nephew, Fitzhugh Lee, to bring his cavalry division to Petersburg. It arrived on March 29th, giving Fitzhugh Lee a total of 7 cavalry brigades. By then, Lee had learned that Federal infantry had crossed Rowanty Creek and that Sheridan's first target was Dinwiddie Courthouse. Lee accurately predicted that the Federal cavalry would attempt to move through Five Forks to reach the South Side Railroad. Upon Fitzhugh Lee's arrival at Petersburg, he was directed to move to Sutherland Station to combine with Pickett and 2 more cavalry divisions, one commanded by Major General William Rooney Lee and the other by Major General Thomas Rosser. Command of the combined cavalry corps was given to Fitzhugh Lee. With Fitzhugh Lee now in charge, Colonel Thomas Munford took over his cavalry division. Pickett's 3 brigades converged on Petersburg, led by Brigadier Generals Montgomery Corse and George Stewart, along with Colonel Robert Mayo, leading Brigadier General William Terry's brigade. Pickett's division boarded trains in Richmond on March 29th, heading for Sutherland Station. Fitzhugh Lee soon updated his orders for Sheridan on the eve of the advance, instructing him to outmaneuver the enemy if possible. The next morning, March 30th, with rain still falling heavily, Sheridan set out to follow Grant's orders. He directed Merritt to take Devon's 1st Division and reconnoiter north toward Five Forks. However, soon after Devon's horsemen started, Grant sent another message telling Sheridan to stop the operation due to the heavy rain and terrible road conditions. Convinced this was a major mistake, Sheridan rode to Grant's headquarters and persuaded him to allow the operation to continue. On March 31st, Pickett prepared to assault Sheridan. The leading element of Pickett's force included cavalry from Rooney Lee's and Rosser's divisions, while Pickett's infantry composed the main body. They aimed west to hit Sheridan's left flank. By mid-morning, the rain had ceased. Just then, Brigadier General Rufus Berenger's troops from Rooney Lee's division engaged the 2nd New York Mounted Rifles of Brigadier General Charles Smith's cavalry brigade. In this clash, the Confederates drove the Union cavalry back over Fitzgerald's Ford, the southernmost crossing of Chamberlain's Creek, and the closest to Dinwiddie Courthouse. On the east side of the crossing, the New Yorkers got support from the 6th Ohio Cavalry as they fired at the Confederate horsemen across the stream. When the rebel cavalry pulled back, Smith sent a detachment from the 1st Maine Cavalry across in pursuit. After wading through the rain-swollen ford, they met Berenger's main body of Tar Heel cavalry and were driven back. Under heavy fire, dismounted troopers from the 4th North Carolina Cavalry splashed across after the Yankees. This bold action soon left them in urgent need of support. A squadron from Brigadier General Richard Beale's brigade crossed the ford next. The 2nd North Carolina Cavalry followed right behind them. A short distance north, the 1st North Carolina Cavalry also crossed the stream. Troopers from both the 1st Maine and 6th Ohio Cavalry fired their carbines at the Virginians and pushed them back to where they found cover with Berenger's men. At mid-afternoon, Berenger launched another attack. The 2nd North Carolina Cavalry met stiff resistance from entrenched Federal cavalrymen who had fortified their positions by then. The 1st North Carolina Cavalry crossed north of the ford, only to be met with intense fire. At this point, Rooney Lee decided to commit all 4 regiments from Brigadier General Richard Beale's brigade to overwhelm the Union troops. The combined strength of Berenger's and Beale's Confederate brigades was enough to force the Federals into a retreat. Meanwhile, at Danz's Ford, the northernmost crossing of Chamberlain's Creek, Pickett's infantry and Rosser's cavalry also tried to cross. A detachment from Major General Henry Davies' 1st Brigade of Crook's 2nd Division was guarding this ford. Most of Davies' men had gone south to help Smith, but were returning when they heard fighting break out at Danz's Ford. Davies urged his remaining troopers forward for support, just as Corse's brigade at the head of Pickett's long column reached the ford. The Virginians waded through and easily dispersed Davies's detachment, guarding the crossing just as Davies arrived. He sent Colonel Matthew Avery's 10th New York Cavalry to delay Pickett's advancing infantry. Avery ordered his men to dismount. However, Corse's soldiers delivered well-aimed volleys that forced them to hastily remount. Davies ordered his troops back as Devon's 2 cavalry brigades approached Five Forks by mid-afternoon, when they heard the sounds of battle from the southwest. With a regiment of Michigan cavalry, Devon rode toward the gunfire only to encounter Davies' men retreating in disorder. Unable to rally them effectively, Devon sent a message for Colonel Charles Fitzhugh to bring his 2nd Brigade forward to help against Pickett's advancing infantry. At that moment, Munford joined in, pressing south along the Dinwiddie Courthouse Road. As he advanced, Corse continued his push. Realizing he was facing a large enemy infantry force, Devon ordered both Fitzhugh's 2nd Brigade and Colonel Peter Stagg's 1st Brigade to retreat before they were overwhelmed. The brigades of Davies, Stagg, and Fitzhugh all reached the safety of Dinwiddie Courthouse by nightfall on March 31st. As the Union situation deteriorated rapidly, Sheridan ordered Brigadier General John Gregg's 2nd Brigade of Crook's Division and Gibbs's 3rd Brigade of Devon's Division to counterattack the advancing Confederates. We hope you found this deep dive into a pivotal moment of history compelling. The choices made here shaped a nation. For more content that challenges the mainstream narrative and unearths the complex roots of our past, make sure to subscribe to Rootvolutionary. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light.